Hey, good evening and welcome to our latest webinar from Fight Club International. Tonight, we'll be talking about theories of war, competing or complementary. If you're like me and you're a child of manoeuvre who's been raised in the sort of era of maneuverist thinking, and all the staff courses and colleges that I've attended have definitely labored that on thick. But increasingly looking around and seeing myself surrounded by a winter of attrition, and struggling to articulate how maneuver might solve some of today's conflicts at the tactical and operational level, then this is probably the webinar for you. By no means should you be dismayed if you are still a maneuverist, ardent believer, that this webinar is going to just trash your favorite theory, for we are going to go through all three: maneuver, attrition, and positional. And that latter one has probably not been discussed as much as it deserves. But also, I think one of the points that we should stress in this is how much have we actually benefited from this sort of internal debate in military colleges, and arguing for or against one particular theory, vice getting after some of the problems that modern warfare seems to pose to us without necessarily being shackled to a mental model or a dogmatic appreciation of doctrine. And I can think of no better person to talk us through this tonight. It's not me, you'll be glad to hear. It's Amos Fox, who's very kindly joined us in a sort of natural pause between his podcasting and authorship.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ed, for inviting me on. I appreciate it. Was it my turn to talk there, or did I jump too early?
I'm about to do your bio, but
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
So Amos has very kindly skimmed his bio down. Believe it when I say he's got a lot more that he could talk about. And some of you on the call on the webinar might actually know him or know of his works and stuff. So you can, if you type in him to a search engine, you'll find a lot of stuff he's written on Russo-Ukraine and other internet sites to do with attrition, maneuver, theory. He often is the person saying the thing we're all thinking, but are afraid to say out loud, or can't commit to words in his artful ways as he does. Some of his pedigree: he got a PhD, a fellow with Arizona State University's Future Security Initiative. So he is an esteemed academic rather than just being a military self-styled intellectual, which a lot of us probably are. He also lectures in politics and international relations at the University of Houston. You can listen to his podcast, Revolutionary Military Affairs. He also does Soldier Pulse and Warcast, and he's on the editorial board for the Journal of Military Studies and a senior editor with Small Wars Journal. So he has a broad range and reach, and he by no means is he a single issue lunatic on this one topic. And at the end, he puts his sort of, like, almost as a footnote, that he's a retired US Army Lieutenant Colonel. And I think many people would agree you had the brains to go a lot further. Just unfortunate that the inertia sort of turned against you, probably because you were speaking some truths that weren't necessarily palatable at the time. And the picture on the right I would throw in. It's not yet out, but it's very much on the cusp of being released, is Amos's book on conflict realism, which, if you enjoy any of the stuff that he writes or any of this discussion, then that is absolutely the book you want to go and get for yourself. Amos, over to you.
All right, thanks, Ed. Sorry for jumping ahead there. So real quick, I think it's important. Context is, you'll see throughout the discussion, and if you read anything that I've written, context is extremely important. And so just a little bit more context about me before I get started on the discussion, because I think it'll help you appreciate why the discussion goes the way that it does, and my assessment, not an opinion, my assessment on the theories of war, fair in this case, are what they are. So before I came into the Army, I was a football coach, American football coach. I coached high school football for a year, and then I coached college football for 2 years. And as part of being a coach, you're not necessarily concerned with dogmatic interpretations of what it is you want to do. At the end of the day, like, your career is determined by wins and losses, right? And if you lose more than you win, you're probably not going to have a job, or you're always going to be looking for a job. And so that was really the foundation of my professional life, those 3 years that I coached. instilled in me this continual pursuit of, if we're not winning, why are we not winning, and what do we need to do to win? And if we are winning, what do we got to do to stay ahead of the competitor who's trying to catch us? And so that's always just been baked into how I view the world. And so I think that's important to understand about me, so that when you read the stuff that I've written or you hear me talk about whatever it is I'm talking about, you kind of appreciate that a little bit more. A couple other things too. I'll run real fast through this, but my career. So I was an armor officer, so tanks and cavalry in the U.S. Army, and I just retired recently. And throughout that time, I was an armor officer. That's essentially all I did. So I come at these assessments not as somebody that looked, at them from a strategist position or some other position that didn't actually get out on the ground and do a lot of this stuff. I physically did the things that we're talking about here, and so my education began as an armor officer. As I was seeking to understand some of the ideas, and I'll tell you a quick story as I run through my career here real quick. So a couple of high notes. I commanded a tank company at the National Training Center when the Army went back to the force on force, decisive action, whatever you want to call them, those rotations where armored forces are fighting each other. So I was there for that transition when we went from the Iraq and Afghanistan rotations to the fighting force on force rotations. And so I saw all the stuff that we're going to talk about on the ground there. And again, it's a training environment, so it's not necessarily 100%, not even close to 100% realistic, but it's not, it's not the real thing, but it's as close as we can get. And so when I left, when I was there for that first decisive action rotation, I was talking afterwards with my squadron XO, my squadron executive officer, and we were talking about fighting, and my tank company did fairly well out there during that rotation, and we were chatting afterwards back at the headquarters, and I was laying out some ideas that I had, I was telling him about what I saw and how I was reacting to things and how things were unfolding on the in the box there at the National Training Center. And he said, "Hey, the stuff you're talking about sounds very much like some of the ideas from this book that I had to read in SAS. SAS is the Air Force version of the Command and General Staff, or not the Command and General Staff, but SAM, the School of Advanced Military Studies." It's like the title of the book is "Fighting by Minutes: Time in the Art of War," and it was by Robert Leonard. And he's like, "You should go pick it up and read it because I think you'd really enjoy it." And so that conversation right there got you, me, and everybody else that's involved in this thing right now, we're listening later, into this conversation. And so that really started my journey to understand these concepts in greater detail. And so I just give you that as context. That was 2013, 2012, when I was there commanding that tank company. And so since that time, I've spent way too much time probably studying these concepts. And I'll get to why they're important here in a minute. But so I commanded a tank company. I commanded a cavalry troop in the 4th Infantry Division. I also ran the Armor Basic Officer course, field training and tactics instruction at the time Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, when the Armor School moved there. And so, like at the micro level, at the tank platoon crew company level, I am intimately familiar with these ideas. And so, having left there, I went to Fort Leavenworth to Command and General Staff College. Was fortunate to get to go to the School of Advanced Military Studies after that, and spent my time there studying the Russia-Ukraine War. And I wrote my monograph, my master's thesis from the School of Advanced Military Studies on the Russo-Ukrainian War and Russian hybrid warfare. And this is 2017, so I was writing it about the 2014 to 2015 time period. So a lot of the things that we see today, I saw back then. And just as a note, hybrid warfare, I don't think is a thing anymore. So if you go back and read my monograph, I don't agree with a lot of stuff that was written at the time. Nonetheless, after that, went to the 1st Armored Division. I worked in G5 plans. Coming out of SAMs, you have to do a utilization tour. So you go work in the plan section of the division headquarters. deployed with the division to Iraq, and I was the J5 campaign planner for JFLIC OIR, so Combined Joint Land Force Component Command Operation Inherent Resolve. So we were based there in Baghdad, and we were the land component headquarters for the fight against the Islamic State. It got the last month and a half of the Battle of Mosul, and then everything after that up to March of 2018. After that, it was the S3 and the XO for a tank battalion in the 1st Infantry Division, or 1st Infantry, 1st Armored Division. I've never been in the 1st Infantry Division. I don't know when that came out. And so I was the S3 and XO for the 1st Battalion, 35th Armored there in 2nd Brigade, 1st Armored Division. And then I moved on after that to, I was a Squadron XO at 3rd Squadron, 4th SFAB at Fort Carson. And so during all that time, and then after that, my last assignment was with Army Futures Command in Austin. I was on a small group of people working to develop the Army warfighting concept for 2040, and then was moved to the Deputy Division Chief of the Army Concepts Division after that. And so during that, we did a ton of wargaming. We go to Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania, where the Army War College is located, and do these quarterly war games that were 1 to 2 weeks long in their in how long they ran. So that was that. Did 3 deployments to Iraq. First one as a wide-eyed second lieutenant in 2005, and then I did 2 more. I did another one in 2008, 2009, and then the one I mentioned about when I was a major there with the JFLIC OIR, and then did a no-notice rotation to Poland for a month. So we got when I was S3 for 1st Battalion, 35th Armor, we went to Poland for a month and trained with the Poles, and that was a fascinating experience. I never knew quite how cold Poland was in the spring, but it was it was beautiful, but really, really cold. And then also just for context, 22 NTC rotations. That's a mix of between being with the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the opposing force, and then being a training unit as well. And then I had 2 JRTC rotations down at in Louisiana. And then just, again, education background, PhD in international relations through the University of Reading. My focus is on proxy war. And then, again, SAMS, I mentioned that. And then, as I said at the beginning of this, I was going to be a coach. And so my master's, my other master's is in secondary education from Ball State. And then my bachelor's is secondary education from Indiana University at Indianapolis. So teaching and learning have been foundational to who I am from day one, hence the degrees in education, and then also the coaching aspects. So all of that is to give you context as to why, as Ed alluded to, I may have said some things that other people were afraid to say or unwilling to say along the way that has us here talking tonight. So anyway, with that, let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. Yep, next one. I think you can go ahead to the why this matters slide. So skip one more. We're going to talk about a bunch of stuff. I hate agenda slides, but when I was in SAMS, I was told you're always supposed to make a purpose and agenda slide, and I generally hate them, so I often skip over them. So a couple reasons that I want to talk about why this matters. There's some folks out there, I heard it recently, in fact, on a podcast, who often equate this debate to like something a major would do in the General Staff College, right? That's cheeky and funny, but I think this discussion is incredibly important because if you don't get this right, you're going to be unprepared to fight and win your nation's wars, or your partners' wars, your coalition's wars, your alliance's wars. And so that, I think, is the first and foremost thing that we have to keep in mind as we work through this. Is it's not just navel gazing, and it's not just something to do to kill the time or to put a feather in our hat. Like, if we don't have this right, if we don't understand this, especially bigger picture, this will cause things like procurement, right? Organizations, do you have the right force structure? If you're built for one thing, but you're continually doing another, and then you wonder why that force that's continually doing the other thing can't win the things that it's doing. Well, maybe it's because back at this level, this discussion that we're having, you were having the wrong discussion, and you focused on the wrong organizations, the wrong doctrine, the wrong technology, the wrong training and education. across that .mil PF solution. The other thing too with that, when we think about education and doctrine, right? If you have doctrine and education wrong, if you have people thinking incorrectly, they're often going to find themselves in bad situations because they just weren't mentally prepared. They didn't get the mental repetitions for it, right? We can't all go out and practice war all the time, but when we do, we can do it in things like war games and conversations and just study, right? And writing. And I think that that's part of why writing's so important. And part of the reason I've written so much is because I think getting the ideas out there, even when the institutions that we may or may not work for aren't willing to do that, is vital. And so getting those ideas out there so that people, when they run into this situation like urban warfare, right? That was one thing that was basically neglected for a long time. And then we, a decade ago, we realized, holy smokes, like we keep finding ourselves in urban wars and urban warfare. So we need to do a lot of things to revamp our doctrine and our thinking on that. And so you've seen this uptick in that. Well, one of the other things we keep finding, like I said at the beginning of this, is we keep finding ourselves in wars of attrition. But then we're like, holy cow, we don't have the industrial capacity to support wars of attrition. We don't have formations, right, that can take a punch and keep moving, right? If a formation's built so thin in terms of the amount of things in it, right? So a tank platoon, a U.S. tank platoon is 4 tanks. It doesn't take much to make that platoon completely combat ineffective, right? So if you have built things with such tight margins like that, formations that can't take a punch, then you're going to spend all this other time doing everything else but fighting, which in turn will cause, additional casualties and things like that. And so that's another reason that this is vitally important. And so I just want those things to be clear. Like, it's not, when we talk about what we're going to talk about, I don't have an axe to grind against any of it, right? I think maneuver, attrition, which I don't actually think is a type of warfare, and positional warfare, I think those are all valid, and they're all useful at a specific place and a specific time, but we'll get into that in just a second. So go ahead and jump to the next one, please. The other thing that I think is critical when we think about the different types of warfare, and again, there may be more. Right now, I think the 3 that continually come to the top are just because of the most relevant when we think about large-scale combat operations, right? But at the end of the day, armies have to be capable, and armies supported by joint capabilities, right? So I think wars are fought and won primarily on the land, right? You can say, oh, what about South China Sea and all that stuff? Okay, that's different. But if Taiwan were to be taken over by China and we were to go in and help Taiwan take Taiwan back, or Taiwan's going to take Taiwan back, they're still going to have to work through land warfare challenges, right? And so these things I think are critical when we think about the types of war as well, right? So armies have to be capable of taking and retaking territory, right? Like you see in Ukraine. Ukraine won't win, arguably, depending on how they define victory, if they're unable to retake the territory that they've lost, right? And conversely, Russia, on the other hand, won't consider themselves having won if they lose all that territory. So you have this back and forth tension between taking and retaking of territory. At the same time, armies must not exhaust themselves in that pursuit. And that goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago, where I was talking about organizations, formations being built with sufficient excess, even though that's not the right word, redundancy, if you will, to be able to take a punch and keep going, right? You don't want to get to your objective and then culminate on the objective and be like, well, crap, man, we got a situation here where we could do maneuver. We could do this massive pursuit on this, defeated enemy that's fleeing from this, specific spot on the battlefield, but we've run out of combat power. And so instead of, capitalizing on the potential of a situation, a positive situation that's emerged, you have to just stop and say, well, we'll fight that fight another day. And then the situation may have changed such that it's you're not going to have the capability to even do that effectively. And so on top of that, armies must be capable of clearing enemy armies from the territory. And so that goes to, the balance of armor versus infantry or mechanized infantry or whatever kind of infantry you're referring to. infantry and engineers, things like that that can go in and help physically remove enemy from territory. Because sometimes they're not just going to flee when you show up and say, "Look at the patch on my shoulder." They're not going to be intimidated by that, or the, whatever your country is, army on your chest. And so when they don't get scared away by that, you have to physically go in and remove them, and that requires the clearance of enemies from territory. And then conversely, you have to be capable of holding territory. Basically, you have to be on the reverse side of that, not prone to being easily pushed off. And that goes back to, again, I think bigger formations, not smaller formations. And an interesting thing when we were talking about territory or clearing and holding territory here, I don't know if you guys saw it a while back, and I'm not a big like, hey, this one time I saw this cool YouTube video from Ukraine, but I'm going to throw it out here because I thought it really resonated with this. The Russian forces had like some rolly ground looking thing that they would go underground and roll this thing over, and it looked like they were it didn't look like they were anywhere. It looked like the ground was just there. And so like that's an instance where, if you've got drones flying around trying to zap stuff, they may not necessarily know those people are there. They can come up out of the ground and cause a really bad day for, advancing forces. So that's just something to consider as well. And then protecting populations, that's also important. I think if you've got sufficient force structure that's almost built into what it is you do, especially Western states that try and adhere to international humanitarian law, that's built into how you're operating, but you still have to have sufficient force with you to be able to do that. And then I think these last two are really, this is where you find the application of combined arms and jointness the most, is armies have to be capable of encircling a hostile force and at the same time also sealing boundaries, right? So if you're able to do that, you can essentially positionally fix, right? So positional warfare, you can positionally fix enemies in place that allow things like, HIMARS and other forms of long-range precision strike or non-precision strike to come in and hit that. Also, you can allow those drones that everybody loves to come in and take care of those problems while the army just holds the corners of the enemy and doesn't let them move, right? And so the same thing too with Air Force and all the other non-terrestrial, is it the right word? Non-land-based capabilities. So those, I think, are important to appreciate these challenges as we think about this conversation moving forward. So if you would go to the next one, please. All right, so give me a second. So strength, I think, is the keystone thing to understand when we talk about the different types of war or the different types of warfare and why they matter. And I mentioned Robert Leonard at the beginning of this, and I was lucky enough to actually meet him when I was at a war game. He was at the war game on our request. And so I got to nerd out and hang out with him for a week and sit there like a fanboy and be like, hey, will you sign my books? And then after he signed my books, I asked him a bunch of questions about everything and pestered the hell out of him for the week that we were there together. I say all that to say, I think that he's one of the few theorists today that truly gets it more right than wrong when it comes to understanding warfare in general. And I'm going to read this to you real quick. But strength, I think, is at the heart of it all, right? And so we have to understand strength. And so he writes that understanding the conditional strength of the enemy is the central part of the art of war because it leads to the discovery that there are two ways to defeat an enemy's strength: destroy the components or change the conditions. And so that's from his book, The Principles of War for the Information Age, which I think is actually his better of all the books. It was, I believe, his last one too. But and so I highlighted in green here a couple of the key ideas. Conditionality, right? So strength is conditional. And I think that really gets to the heart of the conversation we're about to have. And then he says there's two ways to defeat strength: destruction and then changing the conditions. And that's where, so obviously destruction is where you find the attritional school of thought, and changing the conditions is where you find the maneuver and positional schools of thought, and although position bleeds over. And I'll show you two different models. You may have seen them if you've read some of the stuff I've written, but I'll show you two different models later in this conversation that I think helps explain this idea a little better. So if you would, next slide, please. All right, so dislocation is an idea that I think most of us have seen in our doctrine, but I think it's an idea that isn't well represented in our doctrine, right? So it's one of the elements, one of the 4 elements of defeat mechanisms, which that's a conversation for another day too, but I don't think defeat mechanisms is a useful heuristic these days because we don't have mechanistic militaries, we have systemic militaries, and so we need a system approach as opposed to a mechanistic approach, but I'll park that for now. Dislocation, though, Bob Leonard says, dislocation is the art of rendering an enemy's strength irrelevant. And there's 4 types. He defines 4 types. I think he also later actually adds a 5th type. But the 4 types, and this is, I think, the brilliance of Bob Leonard, is positional dislocation, functional dislocation, temporal dislocation, and then moral dislocation. And so I put the highlights here, and this isn't just his definitions. This is an amalgamation of a couple different thinkers and the way that they've framed the idea. But essentially, positional dislocation is the idea that you're going to use position, right, to weaken the enemy's strength, and reciprocally, because this is what I think we always forget too. We talk about, one or the other, what we want to do to the enemy, but everything you want to do to the enemy, you should also be thinking about what do I want to do for myself. And so in positional dislocation, you're using the terrain to weaken the enemy's strength while at the same time increasing your own strength relative to the enemy. You may not actually change anything about yourself, probably won't, in fact, but you're going to use terrain in some capacity to offset their strength and by virtue of that, increase your own. And so I think that this positional dislocation is the basis for positional maneuver and attritional warfare. That one transcends all of them. If you look at functional dislocation, that's using a situation to weaken the enemy's strength and reciprocally increase your own. And by that I mean, functional is a slippery one because the idea is you're doing something to cause the enemy to fight in a way that they're not well disposed to fight, right? So if they show up to a gunfight, and you've got something that, and this is a bad analogy, if they show up to box you and you got a gun, right, you've functionally dislocated them. They may be like the biggest, strongest person there, but by virtue of the fact that you've got a gun, you've just functionally dislocated their strength. And in this situation, you just had better strength anyway. But, and just as an example for this, because I think this is actually a better illustration, when we were at that war game at Carlisle, Robert Leonard showed a video to explain this idea. And it was a video from an old Western movie. And it was this 2 guys were going to get in this fight. I think it was Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid was the movie. And there's a part of that movie where there's this huge guy and he's like, all right, they're laying out the rules for this fight. And they're going through the rules, this and that. And then the smaller guy, one of the main characters, walks up and kicks him in the groin, right? And the guy falls down and he walks off victorious. And so that's the example that he used, he being Robert Leonard, to illustrate this idea. And I thought it was funny and useful. But this functional dislocation, right? A lot of the theorists will talk about technology as one of the ways that you functionally dislocate somebody, different competing technologies to do that. And so, when you look at Armenia and Azerbaijan, the use of the drones on the Azeri side was a way that they functionally dislocated and positionally because they got them in terrain that was ill-suited for tanks, right? So they functionally and positionally dislocated the Armenians. And usually you see these 2 ideas interlaced with one another, but it's the basis for combined arms, the application of combined arms, right? And it's also the basis for attritional warfare, which, again, I don't think is a thing, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. Then you've got temporal dislocation, right? So this is usually time or the pace of operations, however that works, to offset strength and increase your own strength. And that can be done through a number of ways, right? You can do bite and hold tactics, right? Where you just try and bog the enemy down, slow, because you have you know, you may have material overmatch at that point, but they have a lighter, swifter army, but you're able to get them and hold them in place and then just, you know, pound them to the point where you've overcome that strength. They may have like way better tanks, you know, like super sharks with laser beam tanks that are able to, you know, quickly bypass, but you've been able to do something to change the time that they want to operate on for a time that you want to operate on, or not even one that you want to operate on, but one that presents a more advantageous situation. And so you do something in that situation to affect the pace of operations so that it causes their strength to go down, your strength to go up. And so this one, again, this one transcends all of them as well: positional, maneuver, attrition, and the application of combined arms. And then the last one is moral dislocation. This is affecting the enemy's will. I am not a moral dislocation fan. I think it's hogwash. For those who don't speak like Southern Indiana English, hogwash means nonsense. And it's the basis for magical thinking, I think, and maneuver warfare. So those, I think, are critical. The idea of dislocation is critical to understand when we think about the different types of warfare, because it really is the glue that binds them all. All right, if you'd skip over to the maneuver warfare slide real quick. All right, so everybody loves maneuver, right? It's the best, it's the smartest, it's the sexiest, it's the most cost-effective way to fight. And it looks coolest on a slide because you get to draw sweet-ass blue arrows doing big arcs instead of just, you know, the smashing together of forces. Clearly being facetious there. I think when we talk about maneuver, so I put a couple of different definitions down here. The one in the yellow box is pulled from the Army, U.S. Army doctrine. So the employment of forces through movement in combination with fires to achieve a position of advantage in respect to an enemy. Those ideas, I think, are important because tell me a form of warfighting that doesn't use movement and fires to achieve a position of advantage in regard to an enemy. They all do. That's what everybody's trying to do. So this definition, in my assessment, is complete nonsense. Because every form of warfare requires movement. Now, you may not necessarily be moving as much. Every form of warfare requires fires, right? Because otherwise, what the hell are you doing on the battlefield? Advantage, a lot of people like to say, well, you know, maneuver is about the pursuit of advantage, right? And the others aren't. No, who the hell is engaging in a type of fighting where they're not looking for some sort of advantage? You go back and look at the Battle of Bakhmut, right? Russia throws in whatever it was, 50,000 prisoners from Russian prisons with Wagner Group. Like that in itself is trying to generate an advantage. It's a position of advantage, material overmatch in terms of human beings, right? So these ideas, these elements, these components of strength that are outlined in this definition of maneuver doesn't really, like, it doesn't make any sense because it applies to everything. And so I think that that's the first thing we have to understand when we think about maneuver warfare. And the other thing is it requires components, conditions, and situations to be right for it to be applicable. And so again, we talked about mobility, right? So mobility, this one actually transcends all of these, but mobility is a key. And a lot of times to have, to be capable of maneuver, because you can't just show up and be capable of maneuver in relation to an enemy, because everything is in relation to an enemy, right? Or the enemy in relation to you. And so if you guys are relatively equally matched, trying to do maneuver is going to be hard because if you try and move, they're going to be moving with you, right? And so mobility overmatch, mobility asymmetry, I think, is an important element of maneuver. And so, like, if you look at this graphic here, you had M1 Abrams tanks basically doing the big left hook around a bunch of like T-55s, right? I may be an armor officer, but I'm not like a tech nerd when it comes to capabilities on tanks. But I'm pretty sure that the Abrams was a higher quality than the T-55s, T-64s, T-72s that the Iraqis had, right? And so there's that goes into this. So you have to have that. The conditions also have to be appropriate to do maneuver. You can't just show up on a battlefield and be like, hey man, I'm going to do maneuver, right? If you look at this map, one of the key things that you see, and having been to Iraq and Kuwait several times in my life, is that this area on the map here out to the west of Kuwait is just wide open, right? So to do maneuver, you often need permissible terrain that doesn't canalize you along predictable avenues of approach, or canalize you along avenues of approach where you can't get off the road and you're stuck between things like mountains, right? And so to be able to do maneuver, right, to be able to look at your playbook and be like, well, the conditions facilitate this, right? You have to have terrain that supports maneuver. And if you don't have that, you can't do it. As much as you want to say we do maneuver or we're maneuverists, right? In a lot of situations, that's just not the case. So you have that, right? You also have to have assailable flanks. If you don't have assailable flanks, you can't do maneuver. Now, you can create assailable flanks, and if you go back to the First World War, and again, I'm not a historian, but if you go back to the First World War, a lot of the innovative tactics that were developed later in the war, to include, the use of the tank and that combination of tank infantry, artillery working together, was the idea of trying to create assailable flanks, right? Penetrate, create a shoulder that you could then do an encirclement around, and then seal that thing off, and then you've got that little cauldron, and then you can go into that whole Kesselschlacht cauldron battle that the Germans were so fond of doing, right? That's really like one of the key elements there that when you think about maneuver that you need to be able to do. And so if you don't have assailable flanks, you can't do maneuver. You can create them, right? Penetrations and creating shoulders, penetrations, creating a shoulder, and then sealing off a side, right? With, using old U.S. Army thinking, a cavalry screen or a cavalry guard to protect that unit that's trying to create that shoulder. That's another way, but sometimes you can't create it, right? And so this is part of the reason I think when you look at Russia-Ukraine today, and when you look at the failed counteroffensive that didn't work when the Western militaries were trying to push the Ukrainians to do, you got to get out there and do more maneuver. Get after it, fellas. Well, you're stuck on a line. To the north is Belarus, and to the south is water, right? Going through Belarus to create an operational assailable flank, probably a non-starter, right? And then, tanks don't swim across water very well, so you can't really go that way either. And so the idea that you're going to be able to create assailable flanks to then achieve some sort of operational level maneuver in Ukraine is also a non-starter. And so I think those are important things to understand, right? Does the situation, does the terrain permit you to create those? And if the answer is no, then you're probably not going to be able to do that. The other thing with that too is, I mentioned terrain. Sorry, I'm going through my notes. The situation has to be such that what you're trying to do is maneuver again. So, and again, maneuver, like anything, it's different at the different levels. You may be doing some sort of operational frontal attack, but then at the company level, you're doing maneuver. And this is part of the problem you have when you have these conversations is people tend to forget about scale, like, oh, well, you're talking about this, and me and my platoon, we were doing a maneuver because we had like a big road and a field next to us. Okay, like that's okay, but at the same time, like if you didn't have that big field and you just had that one road, you probably wouldn't have been doing maneuver either. So this is why it's important to understand these different types of fighting. And then you've got objectives, right? So what is the objective that you've been given? Were you told to destroy the Republican Guard? Were you told to encircle the Republican Guard? Because those are two different things, right? And you're going to approach that differently. So if you're told to destroy, you may do maneuver to a point, and then you transition into a destruction-based approach to war fighting, right? You maybe transition to attritional warfare or not. So those are things to keep in mind there as well. And then I think that's it for this. Go ahead and skip over to the next one. A couple of points here too. I'm not trashing maneuver. I'm pointing out some inconsistencies and some issues with the idea. So the impact of language on modern warfare cannot and must not be overlooked, right? So now everything's maneuver, right? Maneuver forces. We're maneuvering. We maneuver. We're on maneuvers, right? There's all these different terms that actually mean like different things, but we just use this word interchangeably at this point to where it's lost all value. And so I was reading, you know, if you go back and look, it's almost, at least in American English, if you read stuff and it says they were on maneuvers, a lot of times that just means they're out conducting training, right? And so like you'll still see that used, and people are like, oh, see, but look, he's talking about maneuver. He's not talking about maneuver, he's talking about training, right? And you'll also see maneuvering over difficult terrain, right? That's not the same thing as maneuver. In fact, it's probably the opposite. You're probably moving slowly and not maneuvering. But we use that term to describe things that isn't maneuver warfare, and that clouds our understanding of what is and is not maneuver warfare. And then, you know, people that are looking to find a reference to say, look, he's talking about maneuver, will use those terms, I think, intellectually, lazily, to support their position, right? Maneuverists always want to find a way to say, look, they're talking about maneuver, and this is one of the ways that that happens. And so I think that that's critical to appreciate when you're doing your own research, because I think I would urge all of you to go do your own research on the topic. Not just take my assessment or somebody else's or your doctrine as what gospel is or isn't, because we'll get to that later. But so I think the big implication is when you call everything maneuver, nothing is maneuver, right? This term becomes meaningless. And I think we're almost at the point now where this idea is meaningless. Go ahead and skip forward. All right, so a key point here, so just a couple thoughts on some of the maneuver theorists. I was going to pull out all my big maneuver warfare books and have them here and hold them up as I was talking about this, but I didn't do that. So a couple of things that I think maneuver theorists often do, right? So they don't use empirical evidence to support their theories, right? They just say, trust me, like I reread Race to the Swift because my book is coming out. My book talks about this specific thing. And the book Race to the Swift is like the most nonsensical book in the world because it's just like assertions and no evidence, no footnotes. And the same thing too, if you read like you know, certain maneuver warfare handbooks, if you read certain ones of those that were published in the 80s, they'll talk about similar ideas, but then there's no evidence within there. And the evidence that is in there is shaky at best. You know, if you're quoting German generals from the 1950s and 60s about what they did, we've already found that a lot of the stuff that they've done is more so to elevate their own position after the war, as opposed to like really get after what it means to how they fought. So anyway, they use unsupported positions, questionable sources. They've been military history. A lot of the logic is self-referential, right? So if you read newer stuff that advocates maneuver and you see a bunch of 80s and 90s books and late 70s books and articles, because there's a lot of people that wrote in the late 70s and early 80s on this too. If you read stuff that's been published in like the 2000s up to today, it references that stuff and it's all self-referential, right? And so you've got this loop of unsupported ideas and unempirically supported evidence, right? And then at the same time, they use strawmen to attack attrition as though it's not useful and doesn't actually have a place on the battlefield. And I don't know if you've listened to my podcast, I talked to Jack Watling a couple months ago, and if you go back and listen to that episode, he actually says in there, attrition is central in everything, to include maneuver. And I think that that's a critical thing to understand. So it's ironic that, you know, maneuverists and I would say institutionalists who don't really actually have an opinion, but just say whatever their institution says, use that strawman, mini strawman against attrition. So next slide, because I know I'm running late here. You know, it's funny. I thought I was going to have trouble talking for an hour. Now I'm like, it's going to be hard not to talk for 3. So I'm going to go quick. All right, attrition. So I don't think attrition, again, is a thing, right? Attritional warfare, not a thing. It's just we're talking about destruction-based warfighting. I think for something to be a warfare, it actually has to have like a set of tactics associated with it, right? Or operations, big operations that are like tactics, except zoomed out, right? But there are some people that actually lay it out kind of in a useful way. Alexander Spechin, early 20th century Russian military theorist, also general, also I think put to death, you know, in those heydays of Russian Revolution. But he wrote a really good treatise on that in his book Strategy, and he talks about the usefulness of attrition. And it was essentially that like it's because there is no decisive operation, you use attrition elsewhere or where you want to create a decisive operation to create those conditions, right? And so you grind away over here so that your opponent pulls forces away, which then creates a vacuum over here that you can then exploit with more mobile forms of warfare, right? And so attrition is useful in that regard. And Spechin lays that out really good. If you haven't read that book, it's phenomenal. He actually talks about, he's one of the few people that I've actually seen talk about positional warfare too, although he does it in more of an economic way than a war fighting type of way. And so the Battle of Mosul, 2016 to 2017, right? October 2016 to July 2017, straight up attrition warfare, man. Like block by block, flattening the city, killing everything as it relates to the Islamic State that you could, all sorts of firepower, tanks getting completely eviscerated, you know, infantry getting wiped out. The situation was so bad the Iraqis had to use the counter-terrorist service, the CTS, to fight as light infantry because they had lost so many infantry and because their infantry weren't quite motivated and trained well enough. And so the CTS, and I forget the exact number. I think it was out of their 10 battalions, they lost 14 battalion commanders, so over 100% casualty at the battalion commander level in those CTS battalions. And then again, like that city was completely pulverized, right? I think it was almost 1 million internally displaced persons that were, had to vacate the city. And so, like, to say that we, the West, don't do attrition is factually incorrect. And we, the West, were right there, right next to the Iraqis throughout this whole thing. And again, like I said, I worked in the Land Component Command headquarters last 2 months of this operation, and I can assure you that we were right there with them, helping push and advise them and bring them all the fires that they needed to fight this devastatingly attritional battle. So same thing here. Components, right? You got to have mobility, you got to have firepower, you have to have combined arms and jointness. Conditions, right? A lot of times canalizing terrain is a key, right? If you look at the city of Mosul, canalizing terrain on both sides of the city. So you get caught up in those tight fights where you can't do some sort of bold dash around the rear. You have to just slog your way through that. And then again, asymmetry advantage in probably the air domain, honestly. If not the air domain, at least fire's capability is also a key here, right? And again, you go back to Nagorno-Karabakh. That whole war is an attritional war, right? It was drones zapping tanks from the sky. That doesn't get more attritional than that. And so that's important to think about too when we think about multi-domain operations. Like, what are we talking about, really? Are we talking about maneuver? You know, with these fires brigades at the theater level and these multi-domain task forces and all this HIMARS that can shoot all over the place, all over everything. But then there's like no land force coming in along, or a small land force, right? After everything's been smashed. What we're really talking about, that's not maneuver. We're talking about attrition. And so I think that's a key thing that we need to be thinking about as well, right? And then the situation, right? Destruction, right? If the goal is to, and again, if you go back and look at the policy, if the goal is to annihilate the Islamic State, like President Trump at the time said, and Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis at the time said, annihilate the Islamic State doesn't mean, and that was the guidance that was given to the U.S. military. That's open source. You can go find it in 2 seconds of Googling. That means attrition. That doesn't mean any kind of like bold left or right hook. It's hey diddle diddle. Let's smash these guys with everything we've got, right? And so the situation matters, you know. What else? Opportunity. All right, I'll skip ahead. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So a couple things, a couple of the strawmen I've had a couple things come out recently. I had a War on the Rocks paper come out a few months ago. Had another paper come out the other day, and then I have one in Military Review coming out, I think, at the beginning of September on this, and it talks about these things in detail. But some of the strongmen that maneuverists, institutionalists like to throw out, attrition's a form of warfare. I don't think it is. This one makes me laugh. Attrition is a COFM's battle. No, not necessarily. Attrition is a one-for-one exchange, is focused on a one-for-one exchange ratio. That, to me, is probably the most asinine of all these strawmen that people throw out. Like, who the hell goes and says, all right, guys, here's the plan. We're going to kill one dude, and then, buddy, you're up to die first. And we're going to go tit for tat with them throughout this fight. Nobody does that, right? Because at the end of the day, like I said at the beginning, it's all about advantage. You're looking for an advantage, and sometimes fighting in this way creates an advantage. Sometimes you just have to do it, right? But the idea that it's a one-for-one exchange, I heard a really smart general one day say this, and I don't know if they could hear my eyes roll, but they definitely rolled. Another thing here is that it abuses one's own logistics, right? And this goes back to the previous point. That idea is like, are you thinking in terms of a one-for-one exchange ratio? Because that's not how, even when you're doing a destruction-based approach to fighting, you're approaching the fight. And so I think that that's also important. Then again, these are the best ones. You know, attrition's a lesser form of warfare. Dumb people do attrition. Our enemies do attrition. Stupid armies, poorly trained armies do attrition. And then lastly, the attrition and maneuver sit on opposite ends of the spectrum. You know, it goes back to like I said, Jack Welling said, attrition is baked into everything. It's baked into maneuver, right? You can't do the big, well, you can, but it's harder. You can't do the big left hook, right? Desert Storm, without a bite and hold in the front. It's like Patton said when he used to talk about war fighting. You grab them by the nose and kick them in the pants, right? They grab them by the nose as attrition. You do something to fix them, whether physically or mentally or both, right? In one direction, and you move on another, right? So in that maneuver scenario, just very general, like attrition is at the heart of it. It's actually the first step. All right. So I think that those are important things to carry away from this. Next slide. All right. Positional warfare, very underdeveloped concept at this point. Very few, if you go and look, it's really, really hard to find much written about it. Again, Svechin writes about it in his, I'm pointing at my books like you guys can see. Svechin writes about it in his book Strategy. There's an old book about Marlborough. Again, I'm not from that part of the world, so I'm like, who the hell is this guy? But there's a book on him by David Chandler, who's the great Napoleon historian, and there's a small portion in there that talks about positional warfare. And then there's some Russi had a paper come out a couple of years ago by Siddharth Kaushal that talks about positional warfare. That's actually the title of the paper, but this paper is more strategic economic discussion of the concept. And so it's hard to find information about it. And I've written a bit about it. I put my definition of it here. And this was from a paper that I published in 2017. And you can read it at your leisure there. But I think a couple of ideas to keep in mind here, right? So positional warfare is using terrain, movement, and tactics to lure an opponent into an area that, again, it's almost the definition of maneuver, into a position that is advantageous for you and or disadvantageous for them, right? And so a good analogy I like to use when we think about this is if you've seen the movie Jurassic Park, the tethered goat with the Tyrannosaurus, right? That's always in my mind the idea behind positional warfare. And you tethered goat, you try and lure the thing out so that you can then, like the people that were on the tour of the park can see the dinosaur, see the T-Rex, right? So the tethered goat, that's one approach to positional warfare that I think is useful. And then also feigning weakness is another, right? So, and I'll talk about this briefly here at the end, but when you look at the Battle of Austerlitz, right? Napoleon feigned weakness on his right flank. You know, they set up camp, they had campfires going, and they're like, hey, look here, look at me. And tried to lure the Russians in to attack them there, knowing full well that it was a trap, right? He was trying to set a trap through the use of movement, through the use of presenting one thing, but actually being different in another. And so he was able to offset the strength of the Russians by luring them into a place that didn't support their strength. And so that's another key thing to think about when we think about positional warfare. And then again, this is really where I think the interplay between positional and functional dislocation is like the perfect thing. If you understand those two ideas, you understand positional warfare. Those two things used in tandem are extremely useful to help appreciate the concept. And then I think part of the reason, this is another note too, and I was reflecting more on this. Part of the reason that it's not popular is because it's almost an entirely land-centric form of fighting, right? And so, again, Department of Defense, United States, you know, we like to pride ourselves on our jointiness, right? Being able to use the joint force for everything, and you know, so it's not very reflective of jointness because of the fact that it is so land-centric. And because of that, it doesn't have a lot of currency in places like the Pentagon, right? Where if you're not talking joint, you're not going to get listened to. And so I'm sure it's similar in other militaries in the Western world as well, where you try and also pride yourself on being joint as you can be, given your own nation's resources and capabilities. And so that's why it's often, I don't have any empirical evidence for that, but I just think that that's probably a reason you don't see that. And so the case study that I think it's an important, or it does a good job of showing this is the Battle of Grozny during the First Chechen War, right? Where and this is another idea too, where if you are weaker, positional warfare makes a lot of sense because you're like, hey man, we got this big ass city that we can fall back into because we're just a bunch of guys with shoulder fired rockets and whatnot and rifles, and we don't have a lot of other warfighting capabilities that we can go out and fight. The Russian army. And so you use tactics, right? You use movement to offset the strength, right? So moving into the city, getting into the high ground, or hugging them tight, right? They would do extremely close rushes, essentially, to fire anti-tank systems, and they get so close that the Russians wouldn't either fire their own artillery because they were going to hit themselves, or they got even with inside machine gun range on a tank, which for those who aren't tankers, like you've got machine guns on your tank, and you can infantry, or not even infantry, dismounted fighters can get up close to where you have to stand up out of the hatch with your rifle or pistol and start shooting at people. And if you're in that position, things have really gone sideways. So that is the high point there. Go ahead, next slide. I'm going to cruise these last couple points here rather quickly. Again, I mentioned lack of recognition across the board. I think part of it too is it's unfamiliar, and because it's unfamiliar, that almost makes it to where we're just not even going to bother looking into it anymore. And then again, that lack of recognition further allows maneuverist thinking to dominate Western military thinking. I would argue positional warfare is more common than maneuver warfare, right? We do a lot more positional fighting than we do maneuver. And then maneuver, I think, in my assessment of all this, maneuver is actually a subcomponent of positional warfare. Positional warfare is a big long banner, and maneuver is like the full one out, right? And then I already mentioned the thing about the joint aspects. So next slide, please. And these should be the last couple points here, and then I'll be able to pass it over. Sorry, I'm flipping through my own notes real fast. All right, so this is a diagram from a paper that I published in 2017 on the concept, right? And essentially, there's another picture with it too, and it says position, attrition, maneuver, and it's got the little like arrows that connect the three of them. But at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're looking at the situation, you're looking at what your mission is, right? You're looking at the conditions on the ground, the terrain, and then what capabilities you have or don't have, and then what capabilities your opponent has and doesn't have. And you're going through that and you're thinking about it, and you're like, okay, what can we do? And then that really is what fuels it. And I firmly believe that terrain is conditional, right? Or not conditional, deterministic. Terrain has more to do with what it is you're going to do than all the generals in your army, right? If the terrain says, I don't care what you're saying, general, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. Because really it's almost impossible to overcome terrain. And so with that idea, there's the idea of exchange theory, right? There's fluidity based off those conditions and the situation, the components of strength, all that work together to allow you to come to a point where you're like, okay, this is what we're doing. And I don't even think it's like a decision. It's more like that you get backed into that decision. And really what I think you see is in this situation, there isn't a more important or a better form of warfare. They're just all elements of working together to accomplish a mission, right? And at the end of the day, I really think my assessment is this is how all militaries actually fight. Like you can say your doctrine's this all day long, but it doesn't matter. This is how you fight. Next slide, please. I think when we look at it at the campaign level too, and I'll just breeze through this too real quick, but the Ulm Austerlitz campaign, right? Napoleon's Ulm Austerlitz campaign is a fantastic example of this idea at the operational level, right? At the theater level. You know, they had the big, bold maneuver there at the Black Forest, right? To where, was it Devoe? Was it Devoe? Anyway, the French cavalry encircled Mack and the Austrians there, right? And they lost 30,000, 30, it just vacated 30,000 soldiers from the battlefield, right? Through this bold maneuver, and maneuver in the maneuver sense of the maneuver warfare, not maneuver as in like moving over terrain, right? And so there was that at phase one, right? So when we talk about exchange theory, mission accomplished, that set the scene for phase two, which in this case was the positional element of this fight, right? We talked about it before, the feigning weakness on the right flank, luring the Russians into the positions that helped you achieve a position of relative advantage, right? So that you then had the ability to functionally dislocate the Russians, right? And so that set the scene for the phase three portion of this, where they just pounded them at the Pratzen Heights there. And then the cavalry shows up also at the last second on the left wing to help seal the deal for Napoleon there. And it makes it, instead of this potential catastrophe, it saves the day. It makes this like one of the classic battles and classic campaigns of warfare in general. And if you haven't picked it up, I really suggest, it's really hard to find, at least here in the U.S., but David Chandler's The Campaigns of Napoleon. It's really thick. It's a couple inches thick. It's like 600 pages, but it's phenomenal, and it really does a good job. If you really want to understand the inner workings of this, and he doesn't write about it in the way that I'm explaining it, but if you understand the concepts and the idea of dislocation and strength, and that destroy the components or dislocate the other components, right? It's a really useful book to help broaden your understanding of war and warfare. So the next one, go to the next slide, please. Now this is the last slide. Nope, next to the last slide. But this one is the new construct, the new ontology, to use a big word, if you will, that I think really defines what the types of warfare are. And in this construct, we have like XY axis. You have movement and then contact, right? So it's you're moving a lot or moving a little. That's this side. And if you're doing a lot of contact, low level contact or high level contact, that's the other axis. And then attrition isn't a form of warfare. It's a characterization of the environment, right? And so really, and again, that's why I got the red dotted line here around there. Attrition plays heavily in almost everything because it's involved in everything, right? If you're doing any sort of destruction-based fighting, there is a level of attrition going on, right? Attrition is not a form of warfare, it's a characterization. Oh, look, they're starting to stack up casualties. Man, attrition's starting to build over there, right? But they're still moving. So you've got this this dichotomy that exists. And I think that I think that this is far more helpful when we think about what we're talking about. And I put some of the common terms that we used in the boxes here. I think positional warfare is the big box, and roving, I couldn't think of a better phrase for it, but roving warfare, or, warfare more focused on moving. And so within positional warfare, you have maneuver warfare and then entrapment warfare. I couldn't think of a good term for that one either, but that's where you really have those encirclements, sieges, and then operations when you've closed into an objective where you don't have a lot of room to move. And then on the other side of that, it's more open, probably more open terrain, but you have more, you have mobility or mobile warfare, and then you have methodical warfare. And again, I sprinkled in some of the ideas, some of the common terms that we use that I think really fit within there, in terms of how armies operate, militaries operate within that framework. So I think that this is a far more useful construct. If you're interested in this idea, it's been in a couple of things. This actual this picture here has been in a couple of things I've published lately. It's also going to be in my book that's coming out in September, and there's a whole chapter dedicated to this idea. So I just quickly talked over it because we're running short on time, but I just want you guys to know that and see that and think about that. And again, this is one of those things too. If you have things that you think that I have missed or I'm wrong on, I'm not one of those people that's like, no, dude, you're wrong, I'm right. By all means, let me know. Like, send me an email and tell me what have I not thought about. But if you go to the last slide, slide 20, the so what slide. 22. Oh, that's right. Okay. So the forms of warfare informed PFP, or whichever version of that phrase you use or that acronym you use, right? And so, that's actually a very serious term. And so getting it wrong, getting PFP wrong is catastrophic, and it takes years to overcome. And, non-US or Western EU militaries may not use that phrase when they talk about doctrine, organization, training, all that stuff. But however it is that, those militaries think about that, if you don't have the form of warfare correct, which my argument is it's not one form of warfare, it's all three forms of warfare. If you don't have that within that doctrinal PF construct, you're going to find yourself in conflicts where you're like, man, we're stuck. We don't know what to do. We can't do this. We can't do that, right? Our formations are too small to go make big, bold offensives. Our industrial base is insufficient to support the attrition that we have to generate to overcome this portion of the battlefield, to create that salient and that flank, that shoulder that we're trying to create, so that we can get around that flank and create the opportunity for maneuver, right? All those things, they work together. It's not one or the other, right? And so that's why it's important. And then, I would just urge everybody to think right and engage in dialogue. Again, I think the worst thing we can do is be recalcitrant about how we think about this because of all the things I just laid out, right? This is, it's not some silly ass academic conversation or staff college conversation where we sit around, debating the merits of one versus the other. They're all vitally important. We have to be capable of doing them all. We have to understand how to do them all. We have to be trained how to do them all. And I think that the other thing with that too is we have to break free of the shackles of institutionalism as it relates to how we think about war and warfare, because empirical evidence shows in many cases our doctrines are incorrect, and they are preferential only and not bound in any sort of actual reality. And hopefully here soon that starts to change, given what's going on in the past 15 or 20 years. But nonetheless, I would just urge everybody to go out and start creating change by corrupting the youth, right? You're not going to, as I can attest, you're not going to change some old guy's mind or some old woman's mind. And I say that as a middle-aged person. You got to go out and start engaging with the younger folks and talking with them and saying, hey, tell me why this is what it is. Do you think it's that? If not, why not? And what do we need to do to change it, right? And make it better and make it match reality, make it fit what we actually need to be doing. And so I think that's really the last thing I've got. Sorry, I went a little long, but that's it. Over to you, Ed. I gotta pound some coffee.
Thanks, Amos. That was great. So I'll let the audience compile some questions, and if they want to raise their hands, I can then ask them. I've got one off the top. I've got a couple I wrote down while you're talking. So one of the things, it came up in CGS's chat to Rusi recently. I don't know if you've seen it, but he mentioned sort of what is thought and what is taught. I then added what is fought on the end of that. And one of the sort of observations is the time lag to go from the thought to taught to fought, and the feedback mechanism from the recent fight back into often what is taught for mission specific training, but then slower into the thought space. And the people, and there's fewer people who want to do that for various reasons. So what do you think about the time lag? Because a lot of the problems we have today, you could see that when global war on terror was just starting, a lot of people were probably in institutions talking about major power competition, conventional war fighting, and everyone was then decrying that as being sort of fighting the last war. And now we're just shedding off the baggage of counterinsurgency and stuff. So what my question sort of really is, what do you think the time lag is, and how do we sort of shorten it to make it the timeline of relevance?
I think part of the time lag is admitting that you're in the type of war that you're in, right? And the quicker that you admit it, because I think people on the ground realize it fairly quick, right? But at the same time, if they don't have a language, or they don't have the correct mental models to articulate what they're seeing and what they're experiencing, what they're doing, then they're going to say, and I'm just using this as an example, oh man, we're doing this really weird maneuver fight where it's just like pounding the piss at each other, well, that's not what you're doing. And so part of the time lag is that we don't have the correct lexicon to communicate effectively, right? And so then that slows things down. We also don't have the right, we're often unwilling to admit that things are as bad as what they are, or are what they are, right? If you go back and look at, we talk about the global war on terrorism. If you go back and look at Iraq and Afghanistan, or Afghanistan and Iraq, whichever way to look at it, I was an Iraq guy, so in my mind, it's always Iraq first, even though Afghanistan started first. It took us, the U.S., quite a while to admit that we were facing an insurgency, right? And so if you don't admit that you're in an insurgency, the ability to quickly then learn from what it is you're doing and then reorient yourself is also problematic, right? And that wasn't like dudes on the ground not admitting it. That was the Secretary of Defense not admitting it. And I had, again, not to keep plugging my podcast, but I had John Noggle on my podcast early on I think the first or second season. And he talks about that. And if you read the book, The Insurgents, where it talks about his time working with Dave Petraeus, like he was like literally working across the hallway from the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense said, like, we will not say it's an insurgency. So that, I think, is the other key thing that most of us have no control over. And if the top of the political or military political apparatus isn't willing to accept that, then you're going to run into problems. And so I think that's really, like, big picture. I think you and me, right, all of us, that's part of the reason we're doing these things, right? We want to learn and we want to fix things quickly. And so the problem, though, is the us's, don't have a lot of power, right? And so if the top's not willing to accept that, it doesn't matter how right anybody is, it's not going to get changed quickly. And so I think that's the biggest incumbent to that. And so, yeah, that's a question with not a good answer, because I don't think there is a good answer. You know what I mean? Like, that's just one of those, like, if you don't have the power to change it, there's not a lot you can do, you know. Then I mean, you
Yeah.
look at guys like John Nagel and David Kilcullen and a handful of other people that were like for a while saying, "Hey, look, this is what the problem is. Like we've got not the solution, but a recommendation on how to approach the problem." And a lot of that got stiff arm for quite a while before it was actually accepted, you know.
I suppose it's the classic answer of cultural conservative inertia, but also
Yeah,
we live in an age where someone sees a drone destroy a tank on the news, and then a load of people decry that warfare has fundamentally changed, and
yeah,
we need to change that doctrine, that force design.
yeah,
So we also live in a world of sort of quick thinking, headline grabbing, zeitgeistiness,
yeah.
which I'm not pointing specifically at that example, but you know, AI and machine learning is often then used to just to say whatever I just said is right because I've quoted AI and machine learning.
That's right.
So how does that balance against the sort of the inertia and conservatism of the culture, which we all know is true? It's safe to stay with what you've got rather than to make a change. But we've
Yeah.
also got every new head shed who comes in wants to say warfare's changed. We need to do something about it. We need to spend a load of money on some high tech whiz bang thing that's going to make us all better. Maybe
Well,
that's
this is
functional
where,
dislocation for you.
yeah, no, this is where I think the you see competing audiences come into play, right? So defense industry is always going to tell you what you have isn't good enough anymore and you need something new. So they're always humping your leg to sell you something new, right? Think tanks, I love them, but they always want to sell you papers and sell you reports, right? And if they're not in the room, right, with whomever, they're irrelevant. So they're always going to push to get new ideas out there, whether or not they're all that well informed or not. And so those are two competing things. But then there's people on the ground, right? Who, and this is really like a lot of where my push on a lot of military thinking comes from too. Like I was in Iraq in 2005, 2006 when we were struggling to figure out what the hell to do. And dudes, we were just driving around getting blown up. When I talk about my deployment 2005, 2006, that's how I characterize it. Drive around, get blown up. That was it. We didn't know what the hell we were doing, right? And like we on the ground weren't empowered to do much more than that. And so I think that's part of the problem is you have competing interests, but the two interests with the most power in that situation are the ones that have the ability to generate a lot of money, right? And I'm not trying to sound all nefarious about it, but I think that really does undercut a lot of this. And so, when people see a drone, they need to ask themselves not what it is, right? But what is it doing? Okay, it's shooting things from the sky. Well, we've had things shooting things from the sky for 100 years. That's not really new, It may be doing it a bit differently, but at the end of the day, that's just another application of combined arms and joint warfare, right? So how does that technology fit within that idea? We don't need to throw it out the window. That the other thing too, I think what you see often is bad tactics being not labeled bad tactics, right? But just being labeled like the death of the tank. Again, you go back to Nagorno-Karabakh. That was one of the big takeaways from that was drones and obviated the need for tanks on the battlefield. And again, I'm not saying this because I'm a homeboy for tanks. I'm saying this because I'm a homeboy for military thinking. And like that situation there, you have arguably bad tactics being used in really bad terrain when you had an asymmetry as it related to an multi-domain asymmetry, right, where they had the ability to get up in the sky and shoot down, and there wasn't much the Armenians could do. And so not nobody. It's quick and easy to generate the money for the report and the technology community to say, hey, look, this has revolutionized things and we can make a lot of it. And we can write a bunch of reports because you don't have anything that talks about drones. We have a lot of stuff that talks about the use of air power, right? And combined arms. We got tons of stuff that talks about that. But you don't label it under that banner because that doesn't create money for your company. So I think that's part of the rub.
Okay. Anyone in the audience have a question for Amos? Okay, Brian, I'll read it out for you since you put it in the chat. So, their question is, with how long range and large scale modern warfare is capable of being with hypersonics, space warfare, cyber, and long range precision guided munitions, do you see the current military culture and institutional memory trying to extend a maneuver to ranges that cannot be sustained without a much more industrial approach? For example, trying to maneuver in a setting dominated by a mass of ballistic missiles and PGMs, like a potential South China Sea conflict, is more positional rather than maneuverist. But given the amount
Yeah,
of maneuver culture, do you see the current army mindset something in such case? So I think that's labeling one thing as maneuver because it's comfortable to do so, and just expanding the range of that maneuver to be sort of half a continent kind of thing.
yeah. No, I think if you, I don't know what everyone else's experience is, but I've seen a lot of generals beat their chest and just say, we do maneuver, right? And so if you just say we do maneuver, then everything you do is maneuver, right? And so you do that. You extend this idea to the point where it's nonsense, right? So the idea that you're doing maneuver in the South China Sea, I think is nonsensical. And it goes back to some of the things I alluded to before, right? When you're talking about, you know, these theater fires commands, these multi-domain task forces with all these super duper long range. That's a technical term, by the way. Super duper long range fires and whatnot, and the transparent battlefield. If you believe in that idea, I know some people don't. I'm still kind of waiting to see how all that shakes out. But yeah, no, like in that situation, what you're doing is you're attriting and doing positional warfare until you've closed with whoever the enemy is enough that you probably then will go back into attritional warfighting. So again, I think that the situation, the conditions, and the components that are at play are foundational to understanding that what it is you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it, where you're doing it.
Okay. Just see if anyone else has got anything. If not, I'll go to my
Matt
backup
Bigelow, you
questions.
got a question? I know Matt Bigelow, so I just talked to him like 2 days ago. So
So one from me it's on temporal dislocation. So I
yeah,
read that book. I read the book as well. I think it's great. When he gets into the sort of sine wave of
mm,
time, it starts to lose me a little bit. But yeah, I did like it. One of the particular things he mentioned was that, a military unit of whatever scale spends a lot of time being, quote, unready for combat,
yeah,
but that is not seemingly the time at which we choose to engage in combat with it. And one of the things I wanted to sort of link this back to is our training system, because again, that's the sort of what is taught space, or the practice of what is fought. And in a lot of my experience, the enemy is very much synchronized to your time sequence, both in real live exercises, like when you're resting and doing orders, they're resting and doing orders. When
yeah,
you're maneuvering against them, they're maneuvering against you. And the actual ability for you to be like, well, we want to go after them when they're not ready, is not allowed, because I think the one-sidedness of the likely outcome, even though that is exactly the skill set you want to try and, the skill is in finding the time and not having that done to yourself,
yeah,
and not going into an ambush and all that sort of stuff. But our training system seems to want to create that worst case scenario, which is they're ready. Well, not the worst case, because the worst case is they're attacking you and you're not ready, but very much so just getting this kind of attritional
yeah,
sort of force on force setup through a scripted main events list, and or
yeah.
or observer mentors alerting the enemy to what you're doing. And so I wonder if you've had any experience from NTC on how to sort of actually, because one of the points I keep coming back to is, if you don't incentivize these advantageous tactics in training, people
Yeah.
won't do it, and they'll just go through what the book says. And if the book says, form line and charge, and you're not going to get failed, then they'll do that, even though they know that's not going to actually achieve anything, because they won't, because it's a conservative culture.
Yeah, I think my experience is 100% in line with what you've said here, as it relates to that. The It's hard to get guys or gals, forces to think about surprise, right? Hitting when the opponent's not ready. Because again, that's again one of the key things in that clip that I was telling you that Leonard showed when we were at not Leavenworth, when we were at Carlisle. That was his point, was surprise and hitting them when they're not ready. You know, the guy's up there talking, and the other dude just walks up and kicks him. That was one of the key points that he emphasizes when he talks about this stuff. And so the part of the problem, I think, with this is that we culminate, and this goes back to small size forces, right? Especially now, we keep talking when we're talking about the transparent battlefield. We, whoever, the Western militaries, the U.S., we talk about transparent battlefield. One of the things that comes right after that is we need to make forces smaller, right? I would argue that's the exact opposite thing you need to do, because if you think you culminate quickly now, just wait and see how fast you culminate when you have really small forces. And so when you culminate either on the objective as you've accomplished that objective, that prevents you from then attacking the opponent when they're not ready, right? Because arguably, this goes back to Napoleon too. Napoleon talks about, I forget the phrase exactly, but the pursuit is where you actually like seal the deal in a battle, right? When you're scything down a fleeing adversary, that's how you really gain that decisive outcome in a battle, not just smashing them up right there in the front lines. And so I think that that's part of it too, like small force structure, because everybody's pinching pennies. You know, you don't have a lot of excess to go do that exploitation. And then when you talk about training too, like at the end of the day, like it's human beings operating on schedules, right? And human beings having to run resources at certain times, and a lot of that, just the human nature of not being in combat, causes training to somewhat move into that standpoint. Like when I was at the National Training Center, we were supposed to, the first mission of that rotation, the first decisive action rotation, we, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, we were supposed to, the OC4, we were supposed to roll out at like 4 in the morning, but it was so dark that it was dangerous to roll out at 4 in the morning. And so we waited until the sun came up, right? And so like situations like that, it's just a small, event, one little thing where being too dark and being afraid of injuries, which is right in training, right? You don't necessarily want to just have tanks rolling off cliffs. Stuff like that gets in the way of really getting people to think in those terms. And so I think that that's one of the rubs between like reality and training environments. Probably not a great answer, but
it's a relief to know that it's not just the British experience.
oh no, not at all.
Okay, if anyone wants to raise their hand or unmute or stick it in the chat, then do so. If not, I'm going to move to another question. So Amos, have you found a nation that's particularly enamored with positional warfare? I'm thinking maybe the French, maybe the Germans. You mentioned it's not well taught or understood, but is there anyone who's got a more of a sort of cultural proclivity for it?
Historically speaking, yeah, I think the Germans certainly. The whole idea, we've bastardized, I think, in the West, or in the U.S. West, I guess, their whole approach to war fighting, and it was very much a positional approach. Used big bold movements, but then you did these encirclements and Ketchel-Slag, right? That slow concentric battle after that big movement. And I think it really highlighted the combination of all three of those forms of warfare working together. And then again, I think the French were also fairly good at it under Napoleon, certainly. But an interesting thing that I experienced a couple of years ago, I was in London for a conference, and the UK concept guys that I was talking with had developed a really thoughtful concept that was anchored on the idea of positional warfare. And when it went through the approval process, it wasn't maneuvery enough, and so all those little nuances, right? Those little divots on the golf ball that were, I think, really useful were filled in, and that ball was made nice and round instead. And it was nice and round, and the maneuver approach came to the fore. And I thought that was disheartening, because I thought that they were really thinking about how the British Army, with its size and capabilities, would have to fight if it was fighting not alone, but not as supported as it might otherwise be. And so that's a modern example, and that's just based off conversations with people at the Churchill war rooms one day. But that's it's just so hard to find anything on it today.
Coming back round for the third time. Any questions from the floor? This is a sign of a well pitched presentation, Amos, rather than
not everybody's sleeping. It's cool.
That's good. It's more of a simple one, but I was just thinking about how, if I searched the operational concepts or national defense policy, if I would find the clear, hold, encircle, protect, or seal language that you use, saying all land armies must be able to do the following things,
No.
I'd probably find a lot of other words, some of which you could accuse of being buzzwordy.
Yeah.
But I just wondered, have you found, even going back so far as something like FF and the US Marine Corps pamphlet on maneuver warfare, do these terms, so some of them I'm familiar with as tactical terms, but not necessarily up at the army level. And clear hold build, I'm sort of triggered by from the years of hearing that stuff.
It's not intended in that way.
No, I know. I got you. I got you. I think that's clear to say that those two words have been overdone in a different context. Yeah, got some baggage.
Yeah. No, I put that together based off just years of research, and I was working through some stuff recently. And again, this is also in my book, where I'm laying out, like, this is what armies are for, because I think a lot of times, because of buzzwordiness, we've forgotten what armies are for, and we just throw out words. And so in the book, and in some of the papers too, a couple of papers I've had lately that have come out, talk about this idea in a bit of detail, and they define each of those terms. In this presentation, I just had it, sentence level, but no, I don't. I think a lot of states have forgotten what their armies are for and what are the critical elements of land warfare. And I think that, when you go and look at Ukraine, you really see those. If you pull out that list and run through it and look at what's going on there, that defines essentially what you see going on, both on, reciprocally on both sides. There he is.
Okay, Matt, go on.
Yeah, hey Amos. Hey, I appreciate the call out there. So yeah, we talked about this about a week ago on the podcast, and I'll throw this one back out there because I'd like to get a little bit more from you on it. I just find it fascinating as a force manager. So the reconstitution efforts, that we're seeing in the current Russo-Ukrainian conflict, where Russia's losing a corps, like 2 divisions a month, like 30K, and so. How important is it, or how critical is reconstitution efforts critical to the success on the land on the battlefield? Critical is it to land warfare?
Yeah, I think a big part of that is so again, you may not want to fight attritionally, and that's I guess, if you believe that it's a 1-for-1 exchange ratio type situation, that's noble of you, you being whomever, right? But that doesn't mean that your adversary has the same value set that you do as a nation or whatever, or individuals. And so you can castigate, Russia in this instance for fighting that way, but it's arguably aligned with their values, right? and we talk a lot about IPB. There's strategic level IPB, and if you're not calculating that into your how you're thinking about force generation on your own side, right? Like you may not want to fight that way, but by virtue of an opponent being willing to lose a corps every other month, you probably need to at least build that into how you approach force design, doctrine, training, all that stuff in some capacity, right? Just ignoring it's not going to help you because you don't like it, right? And virtue signaling, right? This is a big thing that drives me crazy too. When you look at everything, social media, think tank reports, whatever the case may be, and senior military leaders talk. This is the virtue signaling associated with this. Well, they're fighting attritionally and this and that. Well, at the same time, like if you look at it from an unemotional standpoint, arguably Russia, and again, as I've said a million times, I want Ukraine to win this conflict, but Russia is winning, right? They've got the territory they want. I don't think that Russia intended to take all of Ukraine. I think they tried to get Kyiv down the Dnieper River, down to Crimea, right? They didn't get Kyiv, they didn't get Kharkiv. But they got a big chunk of what they want. They got the land bridge to Crimea, they got the Donbass. I think Russia's, for all intents and purposes, almost kind of happy with their position. They probably would like a little more, but that remains to be seen. Nonetheless, like you can virtue signal all day about how they're fighting and be like, man, that's horrible. But at the end of the day, if wars are about fighting and winning your war for whatever it is the political objective is that you're put into the fight, then that's what matters, right? And so again, when we do big picture strategic IPB, I don't even know what the term is for that, but when we do that, we need to take those things into consideration and not just take it into consideration and be like, Russia likes to lose a lot of people when they fight wars. I'm going to throw this in the trash now and still focus on small, light, deployable armies, right? And so I just think that that's something that we have to consider when we think about force management. And force managers have to really keep in their mind when they're thinking about, especially, lower level folks. All of us are lower level folks. There's never senior level people that do fun stuff like this. And when they do, you don't get honest answers anyway. So when we advise people up above us, we need to keep those things at the fore of our mind. And then hopefully someday, Matt, you're like the chief force manager and you get to make some real heady decisions that help us offset a lot of those problems that we run into.
All right. Thanks, Amos.
Yep.
Okay, I got another one in the chat. What army, if any, do you think is most capable right now to create a synergy of those different war theories, similar like you explained the Germans achieved in World War II?
I think a lot of that depends on the size of the force, right? The size of your military. And unfortunately, a lot of Western militaries are quite small. And so being able to have that diversity of action, if you will, requires something that's not small. And again, it's all relative, right? If you're talking about an army that can go fight in a theater that's continental in size, then I don't think there's very many that can do that. Now, if you're talking about an army that can go out to the National Training Center and do that, then I think probably a lot of them can. And so I think that that's really the key thing to consider when we think about that is the size of the force helps unlock the ability to do that exchange theory between those different types of warfighting. And that's why you see a lot of the smaller armies beat their chest about being maneuverist, right? Well, we're a small army, and so we have to do maneuver because it's less dangerous and this and that, right? And it's slicker and sexier and more marketable. And so I think that that's, when you run into a lot of the smaller armies, that's also why you see them push so hard to be maneuverist.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more. So we're pretty much on for time. So I'm going to move to my parting challenge. So to everyone on the call, anyone who's watching this, later on the YouTube channel. The Parliament Challenge, which I've been doing for the 2024 series, is just note the fact that today, somewhere in the world, someone is probably training to kill you. Hopefully, in a better way than, or hopefully not in a better way than we're doing to ourselves. But you've heard some of the limitations that we have. What are you doing to get the edge? So think about what is the one thing that you can do in your organization to prepare it for the next war and save lives, whatever that is. Okay, maybe it's showing them this webinar. Maybe it's doing some kind of wargaming activity. Who knows? The ball is very much in your courts. If anyone is watching this and is not a Fight Club member, sorry, first point, if you want to watch this, then it's going to be up on the webinar channel, along with all the others that are there in the ever-burgeoning list. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed, liked, or followed, then please do so. There are our social media channels. And if you have found this interesting and you do want to get more involved in what the Fight Club does, then please go to the website and click join and support, fill in your details, and within a couple of days, someone will have approved your membership, and then you'll be invited to join the Discord, where you can carry on conversations about these and other topics with the membership. And if you are a member right now, you can head over to the virtual bar, the webinar bar, to discuss Amos's excellent presentation. Amos, thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks a ton. I appreciate it. And thanks, folks, for dialing in and listening, and everybody that comes back and listens later. And if anybody, wants to debate anything, anything, whatever, hit me up on email. My email is easy to find. You can Google me and find my email real fast. So thanks again, Ed.